Before introducing our honored speaker, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. And if I can keep my act together here. Here's the agenda. And first I want to thank the generosity of the Hyatt, the General Manager Fred Feinland, as well as the Executive Secretary Jennifer Hillman, and the Director of Events Brian Lane. They did a great job of setting up the room, and they do this without any cost to the club. Also want to thank the Incline Village General Improvement District Rec Department. Our club falls under the senior programs, and without them, we couldn't get our mission accomplished. They support us accounting-wise, materially with so many different events. And Jennifer Moore, who is the senior programs manager, in my right hand is in the back. Give her a hand. And lastly, I want to thank Sierra Sotheby's International Realty for providing the refreshments for us today. Since I am the broker for that office, I coerced them into doing this. So help yourself. We do have question cards available, and the way we'll conduct the meeting is Neil and I have agreed that I'll take them through the accounts in 3 different sections, one being his Air Force career, including the internment, 2 being his flying career, and the 3rd being a spy in East Germany. Many people don't know about that particular portion of it. So, there we are with the order of the interview. A Q&A after each. The cards are out there. If you have a question, please raise the card in the air. One of our members will pick it up and deliver it to the front, and we will address those during the Q&A period. So, I want you all to put your hands together and welcome Capt Black.
Thank you.
We're going to sit down. Let me see where I am. I want to stay, and this is informal. So if you have a question, you want to interrupt, Neil is of the persuasion that he would rather answer the questions from the floor as well as from me. And please do interject as you see fit, or hold them to the Q&A period at the end. We did the slides in conjunction with the questions that I've prepared to give it some visual context to the questions, because some of the people in the crowd are not military, nor do they have military background. So hopefully that will assist us. So this is Neil's picture just before retiring 24 years, and we're going to cover what it took for him to join the Air Force. And this is probably one of the best stories I've ever heard in my life. Now, Neil, how did you get in the Air Force?
Well, as I've told many people many times, I was a troubled youth. And I was sent to a prep school after graduation from high school to pick up my grades so that I could be an Ivy Leaguer, which was never going to happen. The prep school threw me out of its school about 3 months later, and I made a quick escape down a fire exit and out onto the street, and wound up in a little town in New Jersey where I was walking the streets with very little money in my pocket and basically homeless, and saw by the outside of the post office a little sign saying, "Uncle Sam needs you." And I thought, wow, somebody finally needs me. So I quickly entered the post office, went down in the basement, and tried the first 3 doors, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, and they were all locked. They were all out for lunch. The Air Force was busy working as normal, and walked in, and the recruiter said, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "I'd like to join and I'm looking around for what service it was because I forgot. "I'd like to join the Air Force." And he said, "Well, that's fine, young man. When would you like to come in?" And I said, "How about an hour? Maybe an hour and a half." And I related my story to him, and he did have me sign up. I took the the test and did rather well on it. There he said, well, you did so well that when you get to basic training, just tell the drill instructor that you get in your training squadron that you're qualified to go to OCS, Officer Candidate School. And I didn't know any different. I said, wow, that really sounds great. I'm ready for that. So anyway, he took me out for dinner, and I did call my folks, and they came and picked me up. And after that, about 3 days later, I was off to Newark, New Jersey to enlist in the Air Force. And that's how I joined the Air Force.
Fortunate for us that he stumbled into the Air Force door, and no reflection on the other services represented.
They were all out playing golf, by the way.
Right. But once you went through basic training, how did you end up volunteering for pararescue?
Well, in basic training, you don't know very much about anything except how to polish your boots and keep your gig line straight and listen to whatever your DI tells you. One particular day, they had something akin to a job interview. And during that time, a recruiter for pararescue was there. And he asked me if I could swim a mile. Sure. Can I do 50 push-ups? Sure. Well, that's really all you need to know to come in. And he said, I see you wrestled in high school. You should be really doing well in this career field. And that's about all he said. And then I get a message saying, report to so-and-so upon graduation from basic training, and you'll meet others that are going with you to go through your preliminary testing. So basically that's how I joined pararescue.
Let me say I'm slightly embarrassed because his better half of 40 years is in the audience as well, Vicki Black. And please stand up, Vicki, and give her a warm welcome as well. So once you signed up and didn't know where you were going or what you were doing, where did you go?
Well, we got onto a bus, and much like you did, and ended up over at Fort Sam Houston outside of Lackland. And they had an indoor swimming pool, which was heated, and we had to swim a mile, and we had an hour and a half to do it. I think it was something like 42 laps. And I still had this rebellious nature about me, so I said, I'm just going to take my time. And it was, I think I had about 15 seconds left in my time period before I climbed out of the pool. But I was the only one who wasn't huffing and puffing. So the push-ups came, the running exercise came, and then they said, congratulations, you're going to go through pararescue training. And that was it. Today they go through 2 years of training to get to wear that pararescue beret. And the training they have now is, versus the afternoon that we went through to get into the school was something.
You went through Army Jump School,
Yeah.
Navy Scuba School, Air Force Medical School at Gunter, as well as Survival School right up here at Stead, and then pararescue transition training, I think we called it at the time, down in Eglin, and then shipped off. Was any one particular segment of the training more difficult than the other?
I think the hardest training was probably scuba school. It was run by what then became SEALs. They were UDT instructors, and they didn't like the Air Force too much and wanted to see what we were made of. They did have some Naval Academy cadets going through at that time during the summer, and they were all in good shape. But we had already been through stead survival, standing out in the snow without any clothes, jump school, medical training. So this was really the last school other than the PJ transition school at Eglin that we had to go through. So we were all lean, mean fighting machines by that time. And, but it was still a very difficult school. We lost probably a third of our trainees in that school.
We put that in context today to recruit out of basic training. We have a facility at Lackland Air Force Base, and from 1,000 volunteers, we'll get 16 that pass the initial training. Our youth is quite weak to put it mildly. So, after going through all the training, I put this slide up because this is the motto and the oath of the pararescueman. And Neil epitomized this oath throughout his entire active duty and internment. So, I'm going to go on to where you went from Eglin.
Well, Eglin was basically transitioned into tree jumping, where we actually volunteered to jump in the trees. It was pretty exciting. Fortunately, we wore protective gear. And then at the end of that training, we had a meeting with the training NCO, and I think that was Walters, if I'm not mistaken. It was decided in this room where we were going for our first PCS, permanent change of station. And I was thinking Bermuda. We had we had a place in Bermuda, and I'm sitting next to this guy called Hanning Combs. And when it came to Guam, Hanning grabs my arm along with his, and it goes up. So, Black and Combs, you're going to Guam. Congratulations. But Guam was a great tour. I really enjoyed it there.
And after 18 months there, they assigned you to Hamilton Field in Marin County, and you were there a whole week?
Right. I got there. I won't go into some things I did on Guam. I don't think it's necessary to talk about those days. But needless to say, I was still an airman third class when an E2. Never got promoted for good reason. And PJs back then were a bit troublemakers, always getting into trouble for whatever we did. And by the time I got to Hamilton, the squadron commander said, you know, why are you still an E2? And I said, well, sir, I actually had a brain transplant on my way over the Pacific from Guam to your base, so I'm thinking clearly now. And he said, well, in that case, we'll go ahead and promote you to Airman Second Class, but first we'd like to know if you want to go to Southeast Asia to replace one of our BJs who got in trouble over there. And I said, sure. So this is within the first week I got there, and pretty soon I packed a bag and was on my way back across the Pacific going to Southeast Asia.
So you ended up at the Non-Com Phanom Air Base, which is in Thailand, right on the Laotian border. And the Laos were not our friends either. And of course the North Vietnamese were not. And let's go forward to the fateful day. MJ, come on up front, honey. We have a seat for you here. My wife's here. I won't embarrass you, hon. All right.
I'd like to throw it away.
You won't embarrass her. You just point her out in front of everybody here.
Right.
Yeah.
So make the trip to Non-Com Phanom and get checked out on the HH-43. For those that don't know this helicopter, it had wooden plywood blades intermeshing covered with rubber. And it was referred to as the flying outhouse in many occasions. So the fateful day of September 20th, we have an incident take place with an F-105 pilot ejects 10 miles inside of North Vietnam and by the Laotian border. So we were not totally prepared, and just as an aside before I ask Neil to explain the mission, we are the only country in the world that has a dedicated combat rescue force. No other country does. And it's really a testament, and what it does is gives the pilots confidence when they're going in harm's way that we're going to come get you in the event that something happens. So it's a real important part of it. So let's take off and scramble out of Non-Com Phanom when the horn went off.
Well, there was no horn. Somebody just knocked on my stretcher I had laid out, and I was suntanning myself in the back of the cabin. We have a F-105 pilot that was shot down. We're on our way. Let's go. So the helicopter is already preloaded with all of the rescue gear necessary, and sat in a big trunk in the back of the helicopter. And we sat on top of the trunk with our M16 and a flak jacket, and that was it. We were the only real cover for the helicopter going into harm's way. The flight engineer, of course, was busy doing his thing, and the two pilots were flying the helicopter. So I was the only one sitting out back, just open to everything. There were no doors in the back. They were taken off. We scrambled, flew about 40 to 50 minutes at an altitude of about 8,000 feet, and went over the border of Laos and then into North Vietnam. And we were in a place called Ha Tinh Province, about 15 miles just west of the Laotian border, a very hilly country. We had communication with the downed pilot, and soon discovered his area where he was in hiding. We asked him if there were any unfriendlies down there. He said he didn't think so. It seemed pretty quiet. And as we came down to an altitude of about 100 feet to lower the sling to pick him up, he grabbed the sling, but at that time, ground fire opened up on us. Essentially, it appeared as though it was a trap, and this is something that the North Vietnamese were famous for. They would find a downed pilot and surround them and just wait for rescue to come around until they started opening fire. And then they'd either kill or capture everyone. Well, this was the case with us. They did hit our engine compartment several times. We lost power, and we came down in a thud and crashed onto the side of the mountain. Fortunately, it was pretty dense in foliage, and the helicopter, even though it lost its blades going through the trees, it got wedged between the trees and didn't roll down the rest of the mountain. That would have probably set fire to the helicopter, and we would have all perished at that point. So, do you want me to go further?
Let me ask you, when you got out of the helicopter with the pilot, the flight engineer, and yourself, the co-pilot went a different direction.
Correct. You know, most pilots aircrew members train for the unexpected. And you like to do things by reaction without having to take time to think about it. And of course, the most positive reaction was to get out of that helicopter as fast as you could. I couldn't get out the back end. The tail boom had completely collapsed. So the crew chief took his feet. He was about a 300-pound crew chief. You don't see many of those around anymore. But Bill Robinson is his name. He took his feet and he just kept kicking at the side door, and it finally broke open. Anyway, we scrambled out. In the rush to get out, I forgot some of my duties, which were to grab some survival gear, namely the radio, so we could contact what was then the Hybrid, another helicopter that flew with us, and try to get rescued by that helicopter. Well, I forgot the radio, and halfway down the mountain, the pilot asked me, Black, give me the radio, and I said, whoops, I don't have it. So it's my duty. I went back to the helicopter, climbed back up the hill, jumped in it, and I didn't hear any screaming from the enemy yet. They were still far enough away. Got the radio, gave it to the pilot down the hill. He slipped and fell and broke the antenna off the radio. So we had no contact with the airplane, with the helicopter up above. Anyway, as Bob had mentioned, our co-pilot was experiencing some trouble at home. His wife was undergoing surgery. He had a lot of stress going on at the same time, and now he's downed and doesn't know what to do. He has a momentary breakdown and escapes off on his own. Bit of a story about our co-pilot. He does make it into Laos, only to be captured by the Pathet Lao. If any of you had seen the movie Rescue Dawn, Dieter Dengler was a naval aviator, an A-1 pilot who got captured. He later escaped with another captive who happened to be our co-pilot. And that our co-pilot, met the working end of a machete from a native and died in doing so. But Dieter made it out, which his story is a remarkable story, and if you ever want to go ahead and surf it online, I would recommend doing so. It's really quite a story.
And Dieter is the only POW in the entire history of the Southeast Asia conflict to be rescued. No other POWs were ever rescued. It's incredibly. Admiral?
Just a comment, Dieter Dengler could not be kept in our survival school. He escaped a dozen times.
Yeah, that's Dieter.
Yeah. When you went through STED, all aircrew members receive SERI training, and the red letters are what the distinct is: survive, escape, resist, pardon me, evade, resist, and escape. And obviously, this training did come in handy.
Well, you know, the survival school at STED was based upon the Korean War. I went through in the winter time, so it was basically winter survival. Now we're in the jungle in Vietnam, jungle survival, which didn't really start up back in 1965, at least not yet. And the thing I learned in SEER school was that you are still an American fighting man. You know, you had the code of conduct that you could follow to the best of your ability. Nobody expected you to take it to death. Just take it to the best of your ability. Name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. And when that doesn't work, they tell you go to the second line of defense, which is just lie like hell. And that's what I learned at STED.
As you three escaped and hid, how did they find you?
Well, the crew chief, the pilot, and myself all stood together, and we made it down to a creek bed. We saw the high bird hovering overhead, and the pilot pulled out a pen flare and shot up a red flare, meaning get out of here. We found out later that that helicopter picked up 23 hits from ground fire and darn near killed the crew chief. They turned around and left, and with that went any chance of getting out anytime soon. So we went down the creek to try to hide our footprints, and then went up the side of a hill, saw a big old rotted out log, and crawled underneath this. In the meantime, my M16 going down through the mud had gathered mud through the muzzle, making it the rifle basically useless. So I took the magazine, threw it in one direction and the rifle in another. I had my trusty 38 special that we were all issued. So we still had our small arms. We could see the creek bed below us, and they had about 50 militiamen with AKs coming up the creek bed, and they had a tracker in front of them. And this guy was actually sniffing the water. I, to this day, don't know what kind of a sign that gave him, but apparently it was enough to keep him going straight until he found our footprints going up the hill. And there was a lot of yelling and screaming. I looked at the pilot and I said, okay, there looks like we got a choice. And he said, no, there's no choice. And I said, well, if they capture us, are they going to kill us? And he said, well, you know what the intel said. And the intel said they didn't keep many captives at that time. So you had a choice, and you know, you could fight to the death. Maybe some SEAL teams and special ops guys might do that. That wasn't our choice. And it would mean certain death. 5 shots and a 38 special isn't going to wipe out 50 guys with AK-47s. And so we stood up, threw our pistols back into the jungle so they couldn't find it, and stood up, and they scrambled up to us and banged us around a little bit, immediately tied our hands behind us, and had one guy who did find one of our pistols, had the hammer back and put it right up the side of my head, and he was screaming at me in Vietnamese. Now, you know, when that hammer is back, that trigger is a hair trigger, and his hand was shaking like this, and I thought, wow, this is it, you know, what a way to go. But anyway, he stopped his screaming, and then apparently one of the village chieftains was there and took control and told us in sign language, you know, to stay in single file, and we were going to trudge up the side of this mountain with our hands tied, and of course a lot of slipping and falling and facial cuts and that sort of thing. In the meantime, the Air Force had a good target, being our helicopter, and so the 105s that were top cover came down and pretty much dropped some bombs on our helicopter to completely destroy it and everything that was in it. Made it over the hill. The sun was starting to set, and we're on a path now, and we could see this village down in this valley, and they were leading us down there, and they had us, they had ropes around their necks by this time, and they were leading us on like dogs. And they had a gauntlet of villagers that were set up on either side of the path, and they had clubs, sticks, whatever they could beat us with, and they led us through this gauntlet, and they were beating us rapidly with these sticks. And I was thinking about it, you know, and even to this day, I can't really, I can't blame them, because we just bombed their area. Now, granted, we were at war with them, but you can't blame them for being angry. we would be doing the same thing.
There is an old motto for the jet pilots and fighter pilots that do not bail out over a village you just bombed, you know?
Yeah, not wise.
All right, so from the village, you had to make your way by invitation up to Hanoi.
Yeah, Ho Chi Minh sent us a personal invitation, invited us to a party and staying in his hotel. And it took us 5 days to get up there. Well, during the trip up there were times when I really did think they were going to kill me. On one occasion, they took me out blindfolded and hands tied behind my back. Then they forced me down on my knees, lowered my head, and I have a prominent nose, so I could see above a little bit. And then there was a guy with a machete standing over me, and I thought, wow, this is it. I thought I was going, and so I was praying to God as hard as I could. And after that, they lifted me back up on my feet, took the blindfold off. There was a group of villagers off to the side and a big camera that was rolling, taking a propaganda film. And that's all that was. Another time they had the three of us stand beside 3 trenches that were dug. And we thought these were our graves, but they weren't. I mean, you have all these feelings when you see things like that. But in essence, they trucked us up to Hanoi. Took 5 days, as I said. We didn't have any conversation between us, because the minute you looked like you were trying to communicate, you got beat up. And on the way up there, I was interrogated pretty heavily. They applied force and whatnot, and I didn't know if I was going to live or die, so I went to the second line of defense, and I told them I was a doctor. And told them I came from Da Nang rather than NKP, and went through a whole harangue of lies. And fortunately, one time on the truck, the only time, I was able to get close enough by feeling around, and I felt some other legs. And I said, I told them I was a doctor. We came from Da Nang, remember that? And they did, and that's the same story they used. Not that they were doctors, but that they came from Da Nang, so we kept that secret alive. And years later, in fact, Hanoi Hannah on the radio, she was like
Tokyo Rose?
Like Gypsy Rose, you know, in World War II. Said, we have a captive, his last name is Black. He wishes to say to all the troops, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And then they said that the crew that they shot down that I was on came from Da Nang. So
stuck. It's always been a question asked of me is, what type of punishment did they provide? Rifle butts?
Yeah, use your imagination. Basically, you know, the movies are quite prolific at showing what kind of torture exists out there, how human beings can mistreat other human beings. We had everything from waterboarding to vice grip like handcuffs, leg irons, having to sit in a trench and having excrement thrown on you. Just a whole array of things to, not, excuse me, not necessarily to get you to admit what your targets were or anything like that. I was just an E2 and a doctor, and so they knew I didn't have a lot of military information, but I was an American, and my value to them was propaganda, and that was the value for most of us to them. And most of us were, in fact, mistreated for that purpose, strictly for propaganda of all types. The biggest one came in '66 when they had the bright idea to have us all write confessions. And they called us all criminals, of course. We weren't POWs. We weren't privy to the rules and regulations of that were set down in agreements years and years ago. They said, you know, you didn't declare war on us, so you're not prisoners, you're criminals. And I said, well, how can I be a criminal? I'm a doctor. And, you know, all I'm doing here is to treat people. That's my life. And they said, well, in your case, we'll call you an indirect criminal. So that's the way, when I finally got to that point where, you know, I broke and wrote a confession, I said, you know, my name is Neil Black, Airman 3rd Class, United States Air Force, indirect criminal.
When you arrived at the Hanoi Hilton, you were put in solitary confinement.
Right.
And you had a distinguished cellmate next door. And that's an interesting story that you have shared with me, and I think you should share it with the audience. And
Yeah.
before that, Neil, where were you in the compound? I have the have that up there. And if you want to use the laser, it's that top red button.
Well, I'm not attached to any wire
you're not
except
attached
my
to
pocket. Well, yeah, I see you don't have a stage all the way over there. Okay, so what do I do?
That little red thing on top is a laser.
It is?
Whoops.
Here, you take it, you know.
See, this is our first dress rehearsal, and
It's
that
your-
worked. Where's the IT guy? What happened? What happened here?
It's your airplane.
Oh, okay. Well, hang on.
Well,
Hang on 1 second.
while he's breaking everything, I'll go on and explain that I was in a section called Heartbreak Hotel, and much after Elvis Presley would sing the song, and that section, you know, it's a lot easier for me just to step off the stage and do this, as long as I don't kill myself. Okay. So, administration, yeah, it was right in here. It even says it, heartbreak. And it was made up of 7 cells, and one of the areas had a little shower in it. The cells were 4 feet by 8 feet, 4 by 8, that was it. And you had like a 2 by 8 area to walk in. Each side, it's an old French prison, by the way. It was called Wa Vo in Vietnamese, which means house of fire. They used the term fire because of the heat in the summertime. It was just almost unbearable. And so this is September, and it was pretty warm. Sitting in there, they had 2 concrete slabs, one on each side of the cell, with leg irons at the end. And a very, very high, like 14-foot roof or ceiling, which was just over an air vent, and that's all you had was one simple little air vent going in. As I was sitting in there, I had just gotten my POW pajamas, handed in my flight suit, and got a little loaf of bread with things crawling out of it, and a cup of water. And that was my meal for the day. Sitting there, very nervous, by the way. I had no idea what was coming down the road. I had no idea how long this internment was going to last. You always think it's going to end tomorrow. You know, that's the hope. You keep that hope alive. Every day you wake up, you say, well, today's going to be my last day here. You know, I'm going to have the Navy come over with its SEAL or UDT or SEAL teams and rescue us, get us out of here. Or the war's going to end, one or the other. So as I'm sitting in there, I hear this shouting out the door. And it's a guy next to me, and he says, whoever's next to me, this is Lieutenant Colonel Robbie Reisner. Robbie Reisner is a very famous Air Force ace pilot out of Korea, to the point where he had his picture on Time magazine just before he got shot down. So the Vietnamese knew exactly who it was. He was one of the staunchest resistors ever to set foot in that prison camp. And Robbie gave me the tap code, and I took a little pebble that I found on that concrete floor, and I scratched in the grid for the tap code, as you see on the screen. And if I go, that says hi.
And you couldn't communicate from cell to cell. He took a chance of telling you who he was and where he was.
He did. If you got caught communicating, it was punishable, as the Vietnamese like to say. You will be punished. But it meant probably 5 or 6 days of pure hell. And anyway, we got the tap code going, and the first thing that Robbie said to me that I could decipher on tap code was, be prepared to die for your country. Not exactly what I wanted to hear.
Excuse me. I want to transition over to the fact that you didn't stay in the Hanoi Hilton. And there's a misconception amongst individuals in the military as well as civilians that there was the Hanoi Hilton and that was it. But you had an opportunity to have guest accommodations in 6 through the course of your internment?
Yeah, it was amazing. There was constant moving around, and I could never figure out most of the moves. I thought perhaps they were making room for the new shoot downs, which was the case sometimes. Other times, you'd move from one cell to the cell next to you, and the cell population did not increase. You had no idea why they did these things. And they did move us from camp to camp. In about a week after I got to Heartbreak, they moved me over to a camp called the Zoo. You don't have a picture of that one, do you?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I have it up there as 1, 2, 3, 4, the third one down.
Yeah, the Zoo is an old French filmmaking place. All the buildings were colonial French in architecture. It actually looked pretty from the outside, but the inside were all remodeled for prisoners. They had cells and bars in the windows, etc. And I moved into this one cell. It was actually quite large. And the guy next to me was Ev Alvarez. Ev was shot down in 1964. He had already been there a year. And he poked his head out to get his little water jar, and they made a mistake and let me out at the same time. And I looked at him. Ev had a beard down to here. And I thought, wow, that's the way I'm going to look if I'm here for a year. And we kind of waved to each other and smiled, and then proceeded to tap on the wall inside. Ev was an A4 pilot, first prisoner to be taken in North Vietnam.
Go back to the tap code. There was an occasion where someone would tap the G, and what was the purpose of that?
GB or just G?
Just G.
Well, you got me.
Okay, I was reading your article, and he's well published in the Carlsbad area where they hail from, and your article had the G as time to state the Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm glad you read that article, otherwise you'd never know.
In preparation for this, there's a tremendous amount that is published and unpublished about Neil and his entire time in North Vietnam. And it's a spellbinding story that we're going to continue to share as we go along. Any questions at this particular point?
How come there's no K?
Okay, well,
What was the question?
How come there is no K in the grid?
Oh,
If you want to keep the grid at 5 across and 5 down, you couldn't have a K in there. So K is really 1, 2 for down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it would be, let me do it this way. That would be a K. It was the only letter that actually had 6 going across.
What happened to the original 105 pilot that you were sent to rescue?
Name is Will Forby. Will also got captured with us, and we spent some time together in the same cell later on. Yeah, good man.
yes, sir.
Why was it advantageous to be from Da Nang?
Just a lie, because at that time we were told, you know, if ever captured, do not admit that you came from Thailand, because it wasn't known as a base of operation in the war at that time. Yes?
How did you measure time?
I did a lot of walking in circles, a lot of praying. I had 8.5 months of solitary confinement, and during that time there wasn't much to do. You know, you're sitting there, you get up in the morning, you look forward to that infested bread loaf that you got, and some sewer greens, as we called it. And you tried to exercise, but not a lot, because you would lose weight. I did get down to 110 pounds at one time. Just not very nutritious food that they gave us, at least in the beginning. And every now and then they took you out for interrogation. A lot of it had to do with telling us, you know, what great people they were and how they were going to beat us in this war. I didn't know that, in fact, that would come to fruition. But they tried to intimidate us a lot by threats of punishment, i.e. torture, if we didn't follow their orders. At one time, we had to start bowing to the guards, and every time we bowed, instead of saying thank you, we said something else. So just little things like that to keep your morale up. And as I said, just a lot of prayer time. As Bob said, we did have a time where a code was passed down the walls in a separate building, in a single building. And that meant prayer time and a pledge. And most guys, I'm Jewish by religion, so I had a little Star of David that I made on the wall, and tried to engrave a little rectangle with some stars and stripes so I could pledge that. And that was our day, and trying to talk to the guy next to us, little peepholes that we could make. The first year I was there, I tried to escape 2 times that I can remember, and God didn't want me to escape. I'm convinced of it, because every time I got close, I got a bar in a window loosened up where I could almost pull it out and maybe slip through the window to get out of that building. They come and say, you know, get ready to move. Out we go.
Before I take your question, Michael, we had an episode on November 20th when I was at UDORN where they did a raid on the Sante prisoner of war camp. And Neil and I had talked about this episode. I wanted to know when he found out about it. But one of the distinctive things about the Sante raid, which was led by Colonel Bull Simons of Army Special Forces, we had quite a contingent of pararescuemen on board as gunners, as well as medics. And Neil shared with me the raid was successful, but nobody was home. They'd already moved the POWs. Had they been there, the raid would have been successful, and they weren't there because the adjacent river was rising and they thought it was going to flood, so they moved them. What a coincidence.
Yeah. That we didn't find out about it until several weeks later, but we were all in this camp called the Zoo, and this was 1970?
November 20th, 1970 is when the raid took place.
And by that time, in '69, Ho Chi Minh died. A lot of grief and sorrow, of course. A lot of cheering underneath. And at that time, Richard Nixon got elected president. So those two events alone, we think, caused the Vietnamese to change their outlook towards our treatment. And they respected Nixon. They didn't respect LBJ at all. And so, and this is just my opinion, by the way. The treatment changed a little bit. They put more guys together. So now we had something to do. We could talk to each other and kind of lie to each other, yell at each other. A lot of arguing went on after you talked about everything under the sun and had nothing else to talk about. You always picked a subject that you knew the other guy didn't like. And you know, you start debating, and then the debate turned into an argument. And we never had any fisticuffs, but I think some guys got pretty close. And you made little games like checkers with pieces of concrete that you put water on and then squashed it in your hand and rubbed some brick dust on it to change the color of it. And you could get the pieces out and kind of play checkers with each other. Anything that your mind could think of to pass the time away.
Let's take Michael's question.
I have 3 questions.
The microphone's back there behind you. Why don't you turn that on so everybody can hear? Excuse me.
I'm glad she's working this thing and not.
No? Michael, you have a booming voice. Go ahead.
My first question was going to be about the Sante raid, but you've already addressed that. I had a friend that I served with that was on that raid. He said that they were extremely disappointed. Obviously, you all were gone, he said, but
Right.
made sure that nobody else was left alive when they left too. The friend that I mentioned to you before you spoke, Ed Schumann, that also was in the camp. He told me that at one point you all got together and wanted to have Sunday services, and he said they started praying, and immediately the guards came in, and because I guess he was the senior person at the time, they hauled him off, and it didn't go well for him. But he said that the next person in command stood up, and eventually several were pulled out and not treated well, but after that you had services every Sunday. Can you expand on that at all?
Yeah, I recall vividly that Sunday morning. We had just gotten transferred from the camp called the Zoo back into the Hanoi Hilton, into the back area that housed about 320 prisoners. We were all taken back there after the Sante raid, almost the next day. And it was the first time that all the prisoners in North Vietnam were corralled into one prison camp. And they didn't have time really to board up all the windows and separate everybody from yelling out to each other and seeing each other. So I was put into a 20-man room. There were 20 of us. And in an adjacent building at the Hilton, they had another 20-man room which housed Ned Schumann and Robbie Reisner and a few of the other heavies. And they decided that they were going to have Sunday morning prayer, and they were going to have it for the entire camp. And they yelled out the windows, we're having Sunday morning service, everybody up to the windows, and break out into silent prayer followed by a song. and that song was the national anthem. And it was, for the Vietnamese, it appeared to them like it was a camp riot. And it was the first time that they actually showed up in the camp in riot gear. And they thought that the prisoners were going to try to break out and cause a lot of havoc. All it was a Sunday morning prayer service and people singing the national anthem. Well, there, as you already mentioned, the heavies, as we call them, the colonels and the commanders, all got reamed for that one, and they were separated from then on in. They never got together with the lower ranks as we were. But we did have a continuance of Sunday morning services. Of course, in a 20-man room, you had 20 men all praying at once. And we prayed to the God of our choice. And we had some words of hope and prayer that meant a lot to all of us, kept us going, in fact. And it was all done at the same time by giving a signal. And we had various ways of signaling from building to building.
Is that when you went to hand signals?
Yeah. Since the treatment had changed, they didn't ever get around to boarding up the windows. So you could stand on several piles of clothing and get up high enough where you could see over the window ledge into another window. And one of the shoot downs had somebody who was hearing impaired. I'm sorry, sight impaired and hearing impaired. Not sight impaired, hearing impaired. And knew the sign code and developed a sign code with our hands that we could all use. And it was taught very quickly. And so it was with hand signals from one building to another that we knew not only it was time for prayer, but we also knew that it was time to communicate. And if I went, let's see, that's how are you? That quick. And when you got really quick at it, I was a communicator, by the way, for our room. That was my job. It just came very easy to me. And so I could go like this. And we could almost signal, or hand jive as I called it, as fast as you could talk.
Michael?
This is probably a politically incorrect
Not in this room.
subject to ask. I asked Ned a lot, but and he shared everything with me. He was very upfront, but one of the things I asked him about and asked if he was there at the time was when Jane Fonda showed up, and he told me about it, and it was really chilling. Could you share with us, please?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. Jane Fonda, of course, is a big topic for many reasons. I knew that she was there because I heard her on the camp radio talking to we prisoners and saying how glorious the Vietnamese army is and the people, how friendly they are, and we have no right to be over there. And we're getting our due rewards being in jail. And there was a movement by the North Vietnamese to get some prisoners to meet with Jane Fonda. Nobody did it willingly. I'm not even sure that she met with anybody. There is a rumor, going around, and it's been going around for years, that one of the prisoners was forced to meet her and handed her a little note with names on it and service numbers, and that she had turned that note over to the North Vietnamese, and the prisoner got hammered for it severely. That's a rumor, okay? I can tell you this point blank, there's absolutely no truth to it. I don't know exactly what Ned described. There were a couple of prisoners, I think, that did meet with them willingly, and were not forced into it, but you know, these were prisoners that I called, well, I won't go into their real names, but they were basically traitors to the cause, and they were used in this capacity over and over again to meet with dignitaries. I think maybe those were the people that, two guys that met with her. Did Ned say anything else contrary to this, or?
He did. He said that several people actually met her. He met her, and they were able to find scraps of paper. They wrote down their social security numbers, and he shook hands with her and palmed her his social security number. And like yourself, his first 18 months in the camp, he was in solitary, and he said the only two people he knew at the time were the two guards that would come in to torture him. So when he got to meet her and shook her hand and palmed his social security number to her, like you said, she handed that over to the camp commandant, and he said the beatings that he received after that made the first 18 months pale by comparison.
That's, you know, after hearing that, you know, Ned Schumann is a very reliable man, and you know, I would certainly take his word for it. But this, I don't want to get into a debate.
Right.
This has been passed around over and over and over, and we have a very closely connected website with all of us, and it's been talked about. I'll have to check into that even further now that you mention it.
Let me mention one thing. They were all assembled at this point, and your news came in by virtue of the recent shoot-downs, however you could communicate that.
Right.
When did you find out we put a man on the moon?
Well, that was 1969, and Hanoi Hannah was giving one of her broadcasts, and you know, she usually starts out by saying, you know, the American forces lost another so many numbers down in South Vietnam. Will you be the last one to die in this war? And right after that, she said something that was really unusual. She didn't come out and plainly state that we put a man on the moon, but the words that she used were just, if you tried to read in between the lines, you could see that she was talking about a special event that went through that the United States experienced. And there was even something that had to do with space in there, so we got to talking, and you know, it was just guessed that, you know, they did it. They put a man on the moon. They couldn't get us out of Vietnam, but they put a man on the moon.
With your cellmates, you had made mention or predictions or were clairvoyant on many occasions?
Yeah, in fact, the night before we heard this radio program, I had a dream, and I dreamed that we actually put a person on the moon. Don't ask me why I dreamed that. And I said in the morning to a couple of I was in, at this time, also a 20-man room, same 20 guys I was with for probably 2 or 3 years, that we're going to put a man on the moon here pretty soon. And they kind of snickered and went about our business for the day, and then the radio program came along, and they said, Neil, why don't you go over and sit in the corner of this cell and just hum a few times and see if you can tell us when we're going home.
No. Well, and before I take your, Lou, before I take your question, one of the Sante Raiders was Wayne Fisk, and Wayne is is up in New Hampshire. He's retired as the Chief Master Sergeant. And I shared with Neil that I had talked with Wayne, who's suffering from Farr's disease, which is calcium on the brain, and he's preparing his end of life. But he said, would you please pass on the following to Neil? And he hasn't seen this.
I haven't seen this yet.
No.
Well,
Could you read it for those of us that are visually impaired?
Okay. Let me get over here. So Wayne says there was not one man of the attack force who could have not laid down his life to free any of the Americans held as prisoners of war by those barbaric bastards in North Vietnam. Our only wish was that if we were to make it that sacrifice, that we would be able to reduce Ho Chi Minh's military force appropriately, say 1 dead North Vietnamese for every day an American POW was starved, beaten, tortured, brutalized, or made to die while under the benevolent care of the communists. No true warrior would have not volunteered, would not have fought like hell for a slot to be on the assault force to strike on tape POW camp. It was in our pathos, ethos, and our very DNA that if a fellow American were in need, we were to rise up, go forward, and strike. It had always been that way with Americans. They would not be betrayed by this president, Nixon. They were not expendable by political mandate. They were not to be forgotten. We struck.
amen.
Yeah. Lou?
Yes, they did.
Sir, did the North Vietnamese or the Laos try to force you to treat the enemy since you were a doctor?
Yeah, actually, that lie paid off to some extent. The first guy I was put in a cell with after solitary was a down 105 pilot. He had broken his jaw, had broken both arms, and sprained both ankles, ejecting out of that Martin Baker seat. And he ejected at pretty close to Mach 1, which was just, he's damn lucky to be alive. He broke his jaw because his knee board came up and caught him right here. So when they escorted me over to his cell, I looked in there and I didn't see anybody. All I saw was they gave us a little blanket, by the way, as part of our gear. And I saw this blanket rolled up in a wad on the floor. And I said, this guy's really going to be happy because when he gets back from wherever they took him, he's going to find a roommate. And they shut the door, and I'm looking around the room, and I see the blanket move. And there was a human being underneath that wad of blanket. And so I pulled the blanket back, and he's like this, and his arms are like this, and they're just useless. And his jaw was out to here, and you could see he had 2 sprained ankles. And he was conscious, and I asked him, who are you? How long have you been like this? And I tried immediately to treat him. It's just instinct. And the medical training that we had back then is nowhere close to the medical training that our PJs get today. But I had enough to know that he needed help, and he needed it badly. And there wasn't a heck of a lot I could do other than try to make him comfortable as possible. There was a great deal of pain. And then they finally, I yelled and screamed and banged on the door enough to where the guards came and screamed at me, but it got an officer in there and an English speaker, and I told him, you got to treat this guy or he's going to die. And he took him out, took him to a hospital and put him in a half of a body cast. That's what they did. They didn't ever just cast one thing. It was, your whole upper body was casted if you had a broken arm, and kind of crazy. But they brought him back, and I treated him for the better part of 4 months. And in that time, he had his cast taken off. His arms were usable but limited. His sprains had healed, and I washed his body as best I could, and fed him, and brought him back to health. That's what we all did for each other.
Ted, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Bob. My question is, either while you were there or on reflection, were you able to discern what methodology they were using as to who they wanted to eliminate, who they wanted to keep, or why they kept certain people?
Well, it became pretty obvious after maybe a month that they wanted to keep everybody because every American had a certain degree of value for them. And they knew at one time the war would be over and the prisoners would be a source of negotiation. And, as time went on, that in fact was the case. We were used as a bargaining chip. And I'm glad of it, by the way. As far as keeping prisoners alive, they did what they had to do. They never went out of their way to really try to help somebody back from an illness. I had bouts of what I thought was, I called it jungle malady, something akin to malaria from time to time. They wouldn't give me anything for that. Others had dysentery quite often, and never gave you anything for that. It just went away on its own after you lay there for 2 weeks. And there was one death that I'm aware of. A guy named Lance Saijan. Lance, Air Force fighter pilot, Academy graduate, was shot down, had absolutely zero contact with any other prisoner, didn't know about the second line of defense that was used quite often, stuck to name, rank, serial number, and date of birth till the day he died. He did have injuries, they never treated him, and they just let him die. To this day, Lance has his statue at the Academy, and was given a very high award for his service. We did have prisoners end up missing. You could see them going off through your peephole every now and then, going to interrogation, and you always watch to see if they came back. Some guys never came back, and you just don't know what happened to them. They just disappeared.
Lou?
Were there other captors that were not North Vietnamese?
Yes, we had a couple of Thai pilots that were shot down and captured. We had one Royal Lao that was there as well. They used them as more or less as groundskeepers, and they didn't want to talk to us. They all spoke English. They didn't want to talk to us until treatment got better, and then they started opening up and passing messages back and forth to us. And to this day, we keep good contact with them, and some of their children, in fact, who we've helped get into the various service academies.
Were there other enemy individuals that were not North Vietnamese?
Yes, you're referring to the Cuban effort.
Fidel?
Yes, exactly. I don't remember, there were 3 of them initially, and then they ended up with 2. The Cubans used our one prison camp, the zoo, as a training ground for their own interrogators. And they brought these 2 Cubans in, Fidel, and I can't remember the other nickname we gave them. And they had a room of about, or a building of about 10 guys, I think, that they were in charge of. And they were brutal. In fact, they were even more brutal, if that's to be believed, than the North Vietnamese. And they would do the good guy, bad guy treatment. Fidel was the bad guy, and the other guy would be the good guy. And they would go after a lot of military intelligence. And they were intelligence officers, by the way. We found that out later on when CIA informed us that they tracked them when they went back to Havana. after the war ended. But they did end up killing one of their prisoners. He was a B-66 EWO, electronic warfare officer, who somehow had it in his brain that his fellow inmates were also communist spies, and totally flipped inside his brain, and he refused to eat. They developed force feeding methods to try to get food down him. Later, the Vietnamese took him out, and Fidel, you know, the guy would just stare at Fidel, and that really would irritate Fidel when you didn't answer his questions, and Fidel would just beat him without mercy. And the poor guy, his mind wasn't there, and yet he was just getting beat to a pulp. They finally took him out and started giving him electric shock treatment to his head, and came back, and if he could have been in worse shape ever, he was. And he later died shortly thereafter. So that did happen. The Cuban program went on right around 69, 70 time frame, and then when the treatment started changing, they got rid of the Cubans. And the Cubans had very little regard for the North Vietnamese, by the way. In fact, they used to joke around a lot with the prisoners, how these North Vietnamese were really stupid and ignorant, and you know, they couldn't tie their own shoes, that sort of thing. Well, they beat us. So. Guess
Thank you, sir.
One of those little-known facts, in May of 1972, the SR-71 was stationed at Beale at the time and in Okinawa. And Buzz Carpenter and two other SR-71s took off from Okinawa and overflew Hanoi, and simultaneously all three broke the sound barrier to create one huge sonic boom over the city. And that was, I think, aptly called the sound of freedom that was transmitted.
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, I was up at a camp near the Chinese border around that time, so I didn't hear any sonic boom. But related to that, I can tell you that the A6 intruders would come over our camp at very low level and just rock every building there, and it was very interesting to, if you ever had sight of a guard outside your building, to see them run and duck for cover and just leave you standing there. But you could stand there and cheer and yell, you know, come on back, guys, you know, drop a few bombs, you know, right over here in the guard shack. Yeah.
Jack?
I was wondering if, after all this happened and there were so many people involved and certainly not being the way they were when they went into the service, has there been any formal contact on a regular basis or opportunity for you all to get together and hear from somebody maybe that's professional about things that might be needed?
Well, early on, when we all returned and gathered together on an invitational manner for a briefing, the State Department and the Pentagon got together and would brief us on things that went on that we guessed about but didn't know for sure. The briefings were all confidential or secret, and we learned a lot. And we learned a lot about the Sante raid, for example. We had Bull Simon come in and brief us personally about what he did in organizing that raid, and it was just incredible. Today, in fact, up until a few years ago, I was a SEER instructor at North Island for the Navy, and went out to Warner Springs at their camp and had fun with the trainees that were going through, and did that for about a year, and then I just got tired of going up and down the freeway 2 times a week. But that's the kind of thing that we did. We offered whatever insight we could. Air Force guys, other than myself, went up to Fairchild and offered whatever expertise they could offer to that training outfit.
Thank you. The peace accords broke down in 1968 or 69, and then they resurfaced after President Nixon started Rolling Thunder. and you heard a lot of that bombing going on through the course of that period. And were there any rumors surfacing through the course of from recent shoot-downs of potential peace talks?
Well, in '68, most of the air war over the north had ceased, and there was a lot of talk going on. We were shifted over to an annex to the zoo called the Zoo Annex. These were various buildings that were used for film storage. Remember I said this was a French filming quadrant, and the film storage were in these places where they threw us. Very thick walls, very, very little ventilation, but at least we were together. We could still communicate with the people in the compounds across from us by throwing notes wrapped around a rock over to their compound. Every now and then a guard would see a rock go flying over and you get in trouble. It was here in '68 where you could tell from Hanoi Hana and from interrogations going on that there were rumblings about peace talks, that Kissinger was meeting with Trinvan, whatever his name was, in Paris. And about that same time, personally, I had one of these jungle malady episodes, and the guys inside the cell with me said, we're going to complain bitterly. We want to see how they treat you, whether they're just going to leave you alone or actually start giving you medication. This was the brainchild of a couple Air Force Academy grads that were in the room with me. And so they left me lay on the floor, and they yelled and screamed for help, and the guard came in and told everybody in good Vietnamese to shut up. An officer came by who spoke English, said, we have a very sick man here, he needs medical attention. And the officer turned his back and left and never returned. So I think we had a feeling that the talks weren't going all that well. And in fact, they fell apart.
All right. Well, then in '73, the recent shoot-downs, and I think that it's real important, the communications into the camp to find out what's going on in the world came from those most recently shot down. And that was, as best you could communicate between camps and between prisoners, was their only form of communications.
Right. After a while, it got to be almost sick humor, because you knew what a new shoot-down was going to say when he learned the tap code, and you said, when are we getting out of here? And he'd say, tomorrow. 3 years later, he'd be tapping the same thing, when are we getting out of here? So the only news we got from the new shoot-downs were baseball scores, football scores, what college was beating whom. And, we had some news of the war, whether it was going well or not so well. And towards the end, it was a not so well. And it was still good to hear from home. That was our way of hearing from home.
Let's fast forward. I don't want to diminish the days that you were in there, but I try to put that in context. 2,703 days of your captivity. Yeah. But it was coming to an end, and they were preparing you for release. Did you believe it? We kidded around a lot. Of course, we had Santé to reflect back on, thinking that someday our door is going to be kicked open by this giant special forces sergeant, with an M16 saying, "Come on, boys, follow me." That was a constant conversation. And then we talked about maybe propaganda stunts where they take us out and try to convince us we're going home, and just not take us home and demoralize us even further. So all these talks were going around. In '72, there were probably about 100 of us that were shipped up to the China border. And why we were shipped up there, I don't think anybody still knows. They weren't running out of room anymore. The shoot-downs were becoming less and less. The B-52 raids hadn't even started yet. And so we were up there, and the trouble it took them to get us up there
made us believe that when we left that camp to go back down to Hanoi, that was going to be our final time. That was the indication that we were going to go home. And sure enough, in January of '73, they give us the old sign, wrap it up, and put us all on trucks. This time they did not blindfold us or tie us up, and started getting a little edgy. And they took us back to Camp Unity, which was a big part of the Hilton, put us into a 50-man cell this time, and kept us in there for the better part of January and then into February. And then one night, the camp commander called everybody out into the courtyard. And there were guys that were there during the bombing, by the way, that filled us in, you know, and how close they came to hitting the camp, that the guards were all very nervous, the officers were nervous, and they were finally hitting Hanoi, which they should have done 7 years ago. And we were all out in the courtyard, and we were whispering to each other, you know, that they're going to tell us something really important, because we've never all been together out in the courtyard before. This was the first time. And sure enough, the camp commander stood in front of us, gave us the report that a treaty had been signed, that the Paris Peace Accords would indicate that we would in fact be going home in the next 1 to 2 weeks. And word was passed very quickly by the senior rankers in that crowd of POWs. Don't do anything to give them an indication that you're happy, because there are cameras rolling. You don't want to give them that pleasure. And we just quietly walked back to our cells. Once they locked the doors, it was pandemonium, to say the least. What do we do now? We got to make up our go home list, you know. So everybody's, you know, we had little scraps of paper that we collected along the way. You could take a piece of concrete on the paper and make little letters if you were good enough at doing it. And people were making go home lists, kind of like bucket lists. And I still have mine in a box at home. The day arrived, and the night before, actually, they brought us out in pairs of 5 or 6. Wanted to know our shoe size, wanted to know what size shirt we wore, what size pants, and they handed us civilian clothes. And they said, don't put this on until the morning. And, you know, we're still looking at each other like, is this really happening, or is this just another trick that the Vietnamese, I mean, really going overboard this time to make it seem real? And so the next morning arrived, all the prisoners who were going home, which was about 1/3 of us, went by injured first, sick, and then by shoot down date. So I was the 20th guy to be captured, and I knew I was on that first airplane going out, if in fact that's the case. And we lined up outside the cell for the first time in military fashion by shoot down date and in 2-man formation. And the word was given, we all had our civilian clothes on, and we marched out of the Hanoi Hilton for the last time in military order. And the buses were outside the Hilton waiting for us. We climbed onto the buses. They drove us out to Ja Lam Airport. And about that time, when we got off the bus, we still stood in military formation. We could see the 141 pulling up the ramp. They had 3 of them, and they had nice big American flags on them. And we knew at that point, this is the real deal. You know, we're going home. And then we had a look at the contingent of U.S. officers that came off the plane and set up their little table, and they had names, and they would call us up one by one. We all got escorts to go up to the plane and find our seats. Of course, we were greeted by the nurses on board. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about seeing nurses for the first time in a lot of years, but their perfume was quite distinctive. And then we sat on the airplane and waited for everybody to come in. And I still remember the Vietnamese that read off our names was one of the interrogators, a guy we called the Rabbit. The Rabbit was one of the worst there. He had been there right from the beginning to the end. Very well educated North Vietnamese. I guess by his rank he had to be a captain, but he could be very friendly or very evil, and you never knew what was coming. But in any case, he read my name, and I went up the airplane, sat down, airplane loaded up, ramp came up, started up the engines, we taxied out, and once those wheels got pulled up into the well, everybody started clapping and cheering, and you see that picture on the right, that's what it was, exactly like that.
Many people were unaware, Mike, before I get that there was a POW wing established and didn't know that. And here is the history of it and the execution of bringing everybody home. It took 54 C-141s, the 12th of February to April 4th to get everybody out. And tell us about the operation to make a wing out of the POW camp.
Well, as I previously mentioned, after the Sante raid, they pulled us all back into Camp Unity. And it was, at that point, it was the biggest mistake the Vietnamese ever made. Putting us all together like that within communication range caused the first organization of the POWs, the first formal organization. And the heavies who were within communication said, we are going to be the wing called, I'm trying to recall what the number of the wing was. I think it was the third.
The 4th Allied POW wing.
4th Allied, you're right, thinking third. 4th Allied POW wing. Why 4? Because this is the 4th war in U.S. history where we had prisoners, Civil War, etc., working your way up. So the 4th Allied POW wing took its shape there. Rules came down from above. They were called plums by code name. And every group, every cell had its memory unit. And I wasn't only a communicator, and why I don't have my memory today is probably because I used it all up during that time. But yeah, I was part of the memory unit, and we memorized names, basically, and events, so that in case we got out and somebody else didn't, we could relate that information. And we would go over this stuff at least 4 or 5 times a month to make sure that we were up to date. The rules that were passed down were quite explicit, more so than what we initially got. One of the first rules passed to us way back in 1966 was to take torture to the point of permanent injury and death. In other words, you know, they could break your arm, they could pour defecation over your head, waterboard you, do all this up to your breaking point or past it. But if you thought you were going to die, if they kept going, that was that point where you said, you know, what do you want me to do? So some of the seniors really, I thought, had their heads on correctly and kept a lot of guys alive by coming up with that rule. So basically the code of conduct, only give your name, rank, serial number, and date of birth, kind of went out the window because it wasn't holding up. It got guys more in trouble than not.
Let me transition to, before I get to you, Paul. Neil and 2 others were the only enlisted people in the POW camp at that point. And without them prompting, the officers in their 20 or 50 man room got together and recommended that by virtue of their performance as POWs that they received a battlefield commission. And they took a vote, and correct me if I'm wrong, and the 3 of them did not vote, and they asked you, why aren't you voting? Don't you want to be an officer? Correct?
Correct.
So take it from there, is what happened.
Well, essentially, they didn't listen to what we had to say. You know, we were just humbled, extremely humbled, and never put in this position before. We had just gone through a very hectic time. Was at this annex in this film suppository area, and 2 guys escaped. Atterbury and, no memory, Dramisi had escaped out of this depository. Our job was to put our lamplight out on our porch when we were out bathing. And that was very simple. You just took a sandal off and threw it up there, and it's gone. Well, they waited for a rainy night, and they went up out through their roof, which was just a tiled roof on boarded slats. They developed little conical hats. They did all kinds of intel that they could. They covered their faces with mud to make them look more like Vietnamese, although Atterbury stood 6'1", so you know he wasn't all that recognizable as a Vietnamese. But they made it over the wall. They actually did that, and they were unfortunately right in the middle of Hanoi City. And it was nighttime, they were walking down a street, and a militia group came up on them and discovered who they were. They were outside the camp for no more than about 45 minutes. And of course they got recaptured, brought back, and everybody in that camp was mistreated to some extent or another. All the room senior rankers, and every room had its senior ranking officer, be it a lieutenant or a captain or what, taken out and beaten severely. The rest of us were whipped with rubber fan belts, and were without food for some time. The 2 escapees, one lived, the other died. The last they saw of the one guy, they were taking, at Atterbury, they were taking baskets of salt into where he was tied up. And the only thing we could figure out was that they buried the guy in salt, which would take all the liquid out of the body. Very painful method, and he died because of that. Dramisi made it back, by the way. He's back at home now.
Paul,
Yeah.
you had a question?
Yeah, did you ever reach John McCain? And if so, what did you think of him? Surprised that you guys ran president?
Yeah, well, you know, I didn't really finish, I'll get to that. I didn't finish the story of the commissioning. Inside the room we were at, we had 2 Air Force Academy guys and 2 Naval Academy guys. And they were the ones assigned by the senior ranking officer in the room to perform the commissioning ceremony. Word was passed across the way to the camp senior ranking officer who approved it. And we had a, an oath as best remembered by these guys that we said, and suddenly we were second lieutenants. But we didn't have any more pull in the room because we were still outranked by everybody else. So that's the way the commissioning went there at the camp.
And we will continue the commissioning after the release because that's an interesting story as well. But I want to stay on time.
Well, there was a question about McCain.
Paul? Yeah, McCain?
Yeah, I never stayed in a cell with John. I was never in the same camp that he was in. Even when we were all taken back into Camp Unity, a little camp of 11 cells was formed called Alcatraz, and the hardest resistors were taken into that camp environment. They did have one guy die in there, in fact, a guy named John Storrs. Anyway, John was there till just about release time. So I never got to see him. of course, his reputation among everybody there was the highest you could possibly hold as a resistor. And we learned who he was, of course, from our naval friends that were there, who said this guy, you know who his father is. You know, he's PACAF commander in the Navy, and you know, his father before that was an admiral. His grandfather, he said, just came from a total Navy family, and of course the Vietnamese knew that. And at first they tortured the hell out of him, and he almost died. You probably saw some video footage on the History Channel maybe of him laying on a slab, telling his family that he was sorry, you know, that he got shot down and this and that, and he's sitting there with, you know, a full body cast because he broke several bones. And after that, after he healed, he was about as hard as they come. There are a lot of rumors about John McCain, I know, and I can tell you that from everything I know about the man, and I know him personally. I was his state chairman in Pennsylvania when he ran for president in 2000. And I got to see him on a couple of occasions, he and his wife. And I still have the utmost respect for him. He would have made a hell of a president in 2000. And 2008, well, that's another story. So,
Michael, you have a question?
I do. I'm a little surprised that you accepted a commission as a second lieutenant. Don't you know NCOs have a lot more pull than second lieutenants?
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I might as well go into the aftermath upon release. When we came home, of course, word was given right away about the commissioning. Headquarters knew nothing about it. So they were surprised to hear that Air Force guys received battlefield commissions, because the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army are quick to tell you the Air Force never go into combat. You know, so how can you get a battlefield commission?
I'm curious. You know, we saw the photograph of you on the C-141. Everybody's clapping. What about the recovery when you got back? I mean, there's still, I would imagine, a lot of healing. How did the military handle that? Did they do a good job? And what were the lessons learned from that healing process? And are they using those lessons learned today?
Sure. To answer the first part of your question, how did they handle it? With the three of us who were commissioned, they didn't handle it well at all. They took our commissions away immediately, brought us back to our enlisted rank, and I came out as a master sergeant in E7. And the other two were, one was in E8 and the other was in E9. And fortunately, we had a lot going for us. The senior ranking officers put in a lot of argument and fight with the Chief of Staff for the Air Force, General Ryan, Three Fingers Ryan. And the newspapers got wind of it. You know, and the media does have its sway over folks of authority, and they certainly went to great lengths to admonish the Air Force for doing what they did to us after what we did over there. The commissions were not given lightly, I want to say that. The reasons for those commissions had to do with the way we acted as prisoners, as Americans. Even though we were enlisted, we acted no less than any other officer that was there. And according to them anyway, and I say this humbly, that we displayed officer-like qualities. So that's why we were commissioned. This came to a head about 3 months after we got back. Finally, the Chief of Staff called me in personally in Washington, sat me in his office, and he wanted to know if I could speak clearly, articulately, like an officer, which
Allowing for the slurs.
you know, if I would pick my nose in public, for example. Well, he was satisfied with my answers, and he said the Air Force on such and such date is going to commission you as a second lieutenant. And I said, well, General, you know, I did come out with the time and grade of a captain. And he said, son, just be lucky you're getting to be a second lieutenant. So then we had our formal commissioning a few months after that. To the rest of your question, lessons learned, many. Lessons learned were many. One, you learn a lesson about teamwork. And being a team, even though you have a wall between you, you're still a team. You also learn about how to conduct yourself as an individual. You know, I was 20 years old when I was captured. I spent my 21st birthday with one of my jungle maladies laying on a concrete floor in a solitary cell, feeling very, very sorry for myself. And it could have gone downhill from there, but you start talking to yourself, and being in a world where you have so many things going on, you never really have a chance to talk to yourself at length for days and months at a time. And you learn that all of a sudden you have a brain. You know, you can think for yourself, and you can reason things out. You can say, well, yeah, they're beating me up now, but they're not going to do this forever. I'm going to have my days of relaxation, so to speak. And you have the camaraderie of everybody around. And that's the great thing about the military, is the camaraderie. You talk to any troop today, I don't care who it is, when they get out of the service, the first thing they miss is that camaraderie. Going to the squadron, for example, or going to the O Club and drinking beer upside down. You know, that sort of thing, you miss it. The troops who are in Afghanistan, we talk to them quite a bit. I've mentored quite a few at Camp Hamilton who do have problems. And the first thing you ask them is, you know, you've got this desire to go back in combat, don't you? And they say, yeah, I want to get back to the unit. Got to get back to the unit, and that's what keeps them going. And they act as one person, that one unit. And it's also the adrenaline. They miss that as well. You can't get it on a golf course. You can get it flying an airplane, granted. But they just, you know, to get shot at and missed, as a famous person once said, is the most exhilarating thing in your life. I think that was Winston Churchill. A lot of lessons learned. I don't like to talk about religion in a group because not everybody's religious, at least to any extent. And I did become much more religious. I had moments where I felt that God was right there in that cell with me. You know, during nighttime, even though that light was on, the cell would light up for no reason at all. And, you know, I came back and thought about becoming a rabbi at one time because of that. And, of course, you get back and you get back with society again, and those thoughts kind of go on the wane. But, yeah, belief in God is born out of things like that. As they say, there are no atheists in a foxhole. And, you know, there's a lot of truth to that. I did live with one agnostic. Guy's name was George McSwain, and we called him Nutty George. And we were in a 5-man room. We had our prayer service we did it every morning. And George would stand on his bedroll and look out at where the bars are. They were boarded up, but you look at them. And one day I asked George, I said, George, why are you looking at that boarded up window? And he said, I'm praying to it. And I said, oh, you're praying to God through the window? He said, no, I'm praying to the window. That was George.
Neil doesn't particularly like to talk about the awards and decorations that he's received, and I won't spend a lot of time. We'll have this, those that want this presentation, we'll have that available. We'll email it to you if you like. But he was awarded, as was the four-man crew on the rescue mission, the Air Force Cross. For those of you that don't know the order of decoration, the Medal of Honor is #1, the Air Force Cross or the Navy Cross or the Army Cross are secondary. So he has the second highest decoration, and he also has the Legion of Merit. And the words in the citations are compelling, and they do reflect exactly what he went through and why he was so honored. The same thing applies for his resistance to the interrogation and the enemy, and he was awarded 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, the V for Valor as well. And there's one more that is in his 3rd career that I will recognize as well. So we talked about the commission, we got ahead of ourselves there, but President Nixon gave the direct commission to the 2nd lieutenant in 1973. So it leads us to a party that President and Nixon and what was Betty? No, that's Ford. No. What is it? What is it? Anyway. Pat. Nixon. Yeah, thank you. That's my second guess. That they threw at the party on the South Lawn.
South Lawn of the White House. Right.
And in 1975, Neil and I were together down at McClellan Air Force Base when I had the pararescue team, and he was flying C-130s, and we'll get to that shortly. But he told me one thing about the White House party that stuck with me for the longest period of time, and it's that they had the run of the entire White House. They could go anywhere they wanted to go. And he has been in President Nixon's private bathroom.
For a specific reason.
So, the party was hosted by Bob Hope.
Bob Hope was there. Frank Sinatra was there. You know,
the Duke.
Yeah, the Duke was there. They all had wonderful things to say. But and there were a couple of course, women notables from Hollywood that were also there. I don't remember names, so to speak, but they were there. The most memorable thing of that night, other than being with everybody and having a great time, was seeing Richard Nixon wrap a towel around his arm and walk around to all the tables and ask if he could wait on them. And now, if you knew Richard Nixon at all, anything about him, he was one of the most unsociable characters that you could meet. He was very uncomfortable among people. And for him to do this, he had to really, really put his heart into it. And for me, I'll never forget that.
I was under the misimpression that as a single person, you had a blind date that night. And it was a Pan Am flight attendant. And she's with us today, 40 years later, from the party. So that was not the case. Vicki straightened out my bent mind that they had dated a few times prior to that, and then went to the gala. Little known as well is that Neil and Vicki and the other POWs were invited to the anniversary of their return, and that was in Simi Valley?
Now, well, yes, so to speak. It wasn't Simi Valley. That was Reagan's.
That's Reagan's.
Yeah, it was in Loma Linda, Yorba Linda, I'm sorry. There's a lot of Lindas in California. Yorba Linda, but the partying mostly took place in Newport Beach. It was our 40th anniversary of our release, and this was last year. You probably all saw the news reports that came out of it on all the big news stations. It was one heck of an affair. Let me tell you, the Nixon Library put out a festive banquet the last night that matched anything anybody ever heard of before. And Tricia Nixon was there, They had Russ Perot, who was there. They had videos from Kissinger, who was ailing at the time and couldn't make it. Also Robbie Reisner and some of the other high-ranking resistors that were ill at the time and couldn't make it. But you sat there in a replica of the East Room of the White House at the library. And if you ever get a chance to visit it, it is something. There is a display in that library which commemorates Watergate. And I asked the docent in there, I said, I didn't think I would ever see a display of a man's worst times, worst years on display in his own library. And the docent said, well, it was about him. So he wanted it in there. And
Wow.
that's Richard Nixon.
Let's go. So we'll go past the Q&A. So you're home, you're a second lieutenant, you're going to go to flight school. And I got some pictures of the T-38 was the primary trainer. Then you transitioned to C-130s, and then you became an instructor in the T-37s.
Right.
You want to step through any, expand on any of that?
Well, you know, as Bob said, when I got out of pilot training, I got assigned to my old outfit, which was Hamilton Air Force Base, now transferred over to McClellan, this time as a pilot in an HC-130. And got to meet Bob again, and his pararescue unit was, after a while, made OIC of the pararescue unit.
Right. I went to expand on that, I went to the squadron commander and I said, you know, we're all enlisted, we can take care of ourselves, but this particular unit needs an officer in charge. He says, well, who do you have in mind?
Yeah. I'm not sure I could ever jump out of an airplane again and live through it, but yeah, that happened. And I only spent 2 years in the squadron. It was a good 2 years. I enjoyed immensely flying a rescue bird. It wasn't cargo. I wanted to stay out of B-52s. I did want fighters, but this was my second choice. And it was a great assignment. Our kids were born while we were at this assignment, and later transitioned out after 2 years. I was a captain with no college at all, and had to go back to school. So I got a bootstrap assignment, or an AFB assignment rather, to go back for 3 years to Sacramento State. Finished in 2.5 years with a degree in government, and then went on to my next assignment as a T-37 instructor at Mather. For those in the Air Force who know Mather, it's a navigator's training base, and that's what we did in the T-37. We took navigator trainees up, so it was all stick time, which was fine with me. I didn't have to have somebody try to kill me handling the stick, and it was fun teaching these guys how to get from point A to point B and back home safely. And then after that assignment, get into my next phase.
Well, when I was thinking about his next phase, the third phase, is these are the flying years and these are the spying years.
While I was at Mather, I'm getting a little long-winded, but you can put up with my my speech. I started thinking about retirement, and I had coming up in 20 years, and I didn't want to go back into airlines and sit in the right seat and handle the radios for another 10 years. So there had to be something else, and I still had a desire to stay in the service. Service had been good to myself and my wife for a number of years, and I just thought, you know, I wanted to give back. So I wanted to do something else that had some action to it. And I looked at intelligence, and there was a little known intel assignment flying a third seat in a Russian airliner coming back from Moscow to JFK. And if they ever needed a Russian linguist in the third seat who had flying experience, that was the job that I was looking at. So I went over to Fort Belvoir, in Alexandria. I interviewed with the intelligence folks, got the assignment, was waiting to transfer out to go through training, and got word that the assignment had been eliminated. And they no longer did that. It was also an intel job because, you know, you're in a position to be around Soviets and you just keep your ears open and eyes open and pick up whatever you could. Well, I looked again and talked to some detailers, and sure enough, another assignment was out there as an ops officer for what was called the Potsdam Mission. The Potsdam Mission was born out of an agreement in 1947 with the occupied powers to split up Germany. And of course, we know that East Germany was a Soviet zone of occupation. And the Potsdam Mission was a delegation of military liaison officers and enlisted personnel to represent the chief of the Army, chief of U.S. forces in Europe to the Soviet forces in Europe. So we were a liaison. Well, that was just the formal designation, the formal job description. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know much about it, but I left the 237 Squadron. My next assignment was the Naval Postgraduate School for a master's degree in National Security Affairs, followed on by another year at Defense Language Institute in Russian, which I went through. And while I was at the while I was at postgraduate school, I had some Russian area officers go through with me, and they knew about the mission. And so they informed me. They said, where are you going? And I said, oh, I'm going to the Potsdam Mission. And they said, are you nuts? Are you crazy? Do you know what you're getting yourself into? And I said, well, not really. It's a diplomatic job. And they said, well, not exactly. What it turns out to be is a human intelligence collection job. After the training, I did go into Potsdam. I became an operations officer there. What it entailed was traveling throughout unrestricted areas and turn off your recorders. You can't record this. You know, made it out of the field, went down the highway, and went into this town. And I told him, I said, why are we going into this town? We're just going to slow down and get caught. And he said, no, 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 this is a way of evading these guys. You go down some alleys, you know, like a Hollywood movie. You go down some alleys and take some quick turns, go into a parking garage, and that's it. Well, there were no parking garages, but they did have a blind alley, dead end. And we went down it by mistake and got caught. And this troop carrier came behind us and just rammed the hell out of us. Fortunately, it didn't damage the vehicle enough where we couldn't go back to the headquarters on our own. When we were rammed, the troops got out of the troop carrier with their AKs and surrounded our vehicle. And I'm thinking, oh man, here we go again. I'm wondering how many years it's going to be this time. I was not a happy camper. And with that, the instructor told us, you know, cover up everything, pull all the film out of the camera and expose it. These were days before the digital cameras. And that's what I did. I pulled all the film out. And he got out of the vehicle and he said, lock it up from the inside. And he approached what appeared to be an NCO. And we spoke Russian, so it was no problem communicating. And the NCO said, you know, wait here. We're getting in touch with the regional commander, and he will be here. And they're usually a full colonel. And sure enough, about an hour later, this guy shows up. And the instructor points to me to get out of the vehicle. He wanted to teach me how to conduct yourself in a situation like this. And I'm thinking, well, if you hadn't gone into this village, we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. But went over and we conversed with the colonel. We said, no, we were just lost. You know, we were trying to find our way across this field so we could get to this other road like our maps indicated. That's all we were doing. And that was a typical story. The colonel knew better, but you know, he knew that we had diplomatic passports, and there wasn't much he could do with us. He could detain us for a few hours, but the guy was a good guy, and he indicated that we should go over to this tavern on the next block and sit down and discuss this over a couple of shots of vodka, which is what we did. Now, we left the NCO in the vehicle to sit there. So there are times when being an officer is better than being an NCO.
It isn't without risk. You lost one person while you were there.
Yeah, well, there were actually 2 deaths while I was there, and the first and only 2 deaths that ever occurred since 1947 of doing this operation. The first one was a French vehicle. The French and then the British did the same thing that we did, and we all coordinated operations, so we didn't go into the same place at the same time. And they occasionally would set up traps, and the East Germans on this one occasion, their Volks army, set up a trap for this French crew that was out doing its thing. And they encircled the vehicle so it couldn't escape, and then an armored personnel carrier came and rammed the driver's side of the vehicle. They were in a sedan. They were not in an SUV. The whole side of the vehicle was crushed. The driver was killed. And that was the first incident. About, I'd say a year later, Nick Nicholson, a good friend of mine from the Army side of the house, was out doing a ground patrol and saw a tank shed, an area where the Soviets would keep their tanks, getting them ready to go on deployment. And the guard was not around the tank shed, so he took the opportunity to get out of the vehicle and approach the shed to see if he could get in there and maybe take some pictures inside the tank or do whatever he wanted to do with that tank. About that time, a guard came out of the woods, and apparently he was off his guard station, saw somebody there, got nervous, and started shooting. And he hit Nick and knocked him down, and he was still alive and screaming for help. The driver got out of the vehicle, approached his major, knelt down to try to help him any way he could. Nick had a shot that went right through his upper abdomen, and the guard came over and put the AK next to the sergeant's head and told him in sign language, get back in the vehicle. So the sergeant, the soldier would not allow the driver to attend to Nick at all, and Nick died a moment later. There wasn't much the sergeant could have done anyway. And that caused an uproar, of course. Now we have a dead American out there, the first one ever to be killed. And it created a firestorm within our relations with the Soviets. We escorted his body back. He was buried at Arlington under full colors, right next to Joe Louis, in fact. Very honorable spot to be. And Reagan, at that time, was at Reykjavik going through nuclear arms talks with the Soviets, and did not want, this is my opinion, did not want anything to wreck those talks. And basically, they had a Senate investigating committee pull up our chief of mission and fire a lot of questions at him, and then it was just swept under the table. It was done. But we never had the same relationships with the Soviets. Even though they were aggressive before that, they were even more aggressive after that. And it wasn't uncommon to get shot at after that. It was not uncommon, but we had no more incidents.
But by virtue, by virtue of his performance during the course of those years and the Potsdam mission, Neil was awarded, and this is just in the order again, below the Air Force Cross, He was awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal, and the slide speaks for itself as to what Neil was able to do during the course of his tenure at the mission.
This was on the previous slide. I was wondering if you had a reason why you showed the front and the back of the patch.
That was my choice. During the course of research, I was curious that did they flip the patch around at any one particular time? Did they display the patch at all?
Yeah, there were some rules of the road. We always had to travel in uniform wherever we went. We mostly wore BDUs, and we had to have our rank and our service patch on there. That was all. You didn't have to have your name or anything else because you had your diplomatic passport with your name on it. Yes?
Michael?
Interesting to meet somebody that actually worked with USM LM. I was a second lieutenant in Germany back in the late 70s, assigned to a tank battalion, and we had gotten an alert and had to, our GDP positions were out there fullest, so we're out there and it rained the entire time. I remember it vividly. It was miserable, but we were pulling into a position, pulling the tanks into a position, and there was this black car over on the other side of the road. We know that when you were assigned to Germany at the time, you were giving multiple briefings, but one was about the military liaison mission and the types of cars that they drove and the distinctive license plate that identified them as being part of the Soviet military liaison mission. So I recognized, actually, my driver spotted them first, and I started cacking up the information to send it forward, and he kept moving around, so I decided to send a message and clear. And after a few minutes, it came back, and I was told to position my platoon of tanks on either side of the road, so this, this spy, the Soviet spy, couldn't get away.
Right.
But it came back too late, and he had left.
That's a shame.
I'm curious, did you have interface with the Soviet military liaison mission at all?
Not really interface. We had nothing to do with them. They had their zone of occupation, i.e. the French, Brits, and the U.S. zones in Western Germany. On occasion, we did go over to Frankfurt and got with MI, who had a special assignment to track these guys. And we were all in civilian clothes and jumped in an MI sedan, unmarked, and they took us to a spot where they knew the Soviet MLM guys would show up. Now these guys were different than us. They wore a leather jacket, which they called a military jacket, but it had no insignia on it at all. They looked like any other civilian. And they ran spies, something we did not do. We did not run spies. So we pulled up into this, aside this wooded area. There were other cars there from the civilian populace walking through a park, etc. And this was a place where they had a drop. The Soviets had a drop. And our guys knew about it. And they said, if you see one of them get out of the car, we're close enough where they can see us. We'll get out of the car and go into the woods, acting like Germans usually do when they go into the woods from a car to do what they have to do, by a tree, and go back into the car. So that's exactly what we did. Got back into the car. The Soviet gets back into his car, doesn't notice us at all, and he drives on. And we never went to check the drop place at all to see what was there. That was none of our business. That was getting too involved. So yeah, we did see those guys. We were a lot more obvious out there than they were.
I thought it was interesting, you said you were in BDUs, and I remember this, that the two individuals in the car did not have uniforms on. And
right.
The car really was about, from where I was standing in my tank, about from here to the screen was his car.
Yeah.
And I remember they both were looking through binoculars, and I intentionally showed them my name tag right here, just in case they couldn't see it through the rain.
All right, thank you. Okay, go ahead.
It's just too bad you didn't have a chance to knock their vehicle on its side.
All right. This is the flash that is on the maroon beret that pararescuemen wear. And I wanted to put that up as the final slide, because Neil and I, if we had the bodies, we still have the minds, we would be back in the mix with those guys.
Exactly, yeah.
And they're doing, Neil was able to get to the reunion this year down in Albuquerque last month. I was not. But he and Vicki were treated extremely well by all. And there was 350 attended, I believe.
Right.
And it was just wonderful that he had an opportunity, as did Art Cormier, who was the accompanying pararescueman that was shot down a little over a month after Neil was, and received a commission too. So if there aren't any other questions, the way that we're going to wrap this up is to turn off the computer, turn off the mics, and go to the Cutthroat Saloon for a post-mission libation. And you're welcome to join us. And Neil and Vicki will be available if you'd like to speak with them. And if you want any pictures, we can do that in this room as well if you'd like to have photographs with them. So that's a wrap, and I really appreciate all of you attending today.
I just had one more. I just have a closing comment that I'd like to make. You know, for me, it's truly an honor, and I don't say that lightly, to have the chance to speak with fellow veterans and others who are interested in the history of it all, and interested in me personally. And I will take this meeting with me as a memorable moment for the rest of my life. Thank you very much.